All right. So we've been talking all along about the importance of cybersecurity, information privacy, and the like. And here is an area where this applies, where consequences are frighteningly real. Although this is more about simulation, but nonetheless, one of our faculty who works in nuclear engineering here, Ani, is going to tell you about the research he's been doing with Elisa Bertino, and take it away.
I think I can only change from here, right? All right. How about now? This is definitely a great turnout. I didn't realize it's going to be that big, but so hopefully I won't say anything embarrassing. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you about cybersecurity. But in reality, I'm not really going to talk about cybersecurity at all. I'm going to talk about the engineering side. So I personally don't have computer science background, and I stopped doing programming maybe 15 years ago. So the goal here is to think anytime you design an engineering system, there will be some vulnerabilities. The more complex the system becomes, some new vulnerabilities you may know about from experience, or you may discover them from simulation. So the idea is, if you know that, could that be used or exploited by a cyber attack? Okay, so how the cyber attack is started, that's not really part of the scope of this work. Okay, so you can think of us as a second line of defense after the information type security measures have been compromised. Okay, so nuclear reactors, I'm not really going to give you examples of accidents that could happen here. The idea is not to scare anybody, but this is the message here is that this is an example of an industrial control system. And information about it, it's not really hidden. There's a lot of interest in nuclear reactors and other types of reactors like chemical plants, fossil plants, water treatment, etc., that are very common to the world landscape. So there's a lot of expertise on these systems overseas, and we pretty much know how to run them and simulate them. So for these class of systems where not much is hidden, is it possible for the attackers to learn the vulnerabilities and then use them to devise some or launch some attack? And at that point, what would you do? Okay. So some other systems that have a lot of proprietary information and a lot is not really in the public domain, it will be very difficult to launch these types of attacks. Okay. So my opening lines here is the safety and security obviously are very important for a DOE, NE, Department of Energy Nuclear Engineering, to protect the population. That's the general statement. And in the last 10 years or so, there are a lot of efforts directed to modernizing the reactor control systems, which were traditionally very analog type. But this is similar to many other industries as well. So with more digitization on the way, and also more new nuclear reactors that are going to start with being digitized from the start, then there's obviously a concern about somebody breaching the data and then trying to launch something that's malicious to the reactor. Okay. So that's the question that we're posing here. Security breaches lead to safety-related accidents. How the breach happens, that's not the topic here, but once it's started, can they initiate some malicious behavior for the reactor? So some other follow-up questions that we also think about is the reactor state, can it be falsified by computer virus or attack, a rogue code attacking the control system, and if that's, how do you introduce that? That's one of the questions that are out there that I'm not going to try to really address. I just have a couple slides on it, but that's not really the goal of the research. And if the virus can be introduced into the control system, how can you initiate an event that the operator won't notice? Okay, and so what kind of accidents can occur? And then if you initiate these types of events, will the physics on its own cause the reactor to be safe? A lot of these systems are designed to be inherently safe. So if something goes wrong, the system can recover on its own. So that's one of the questions we have to pose. If some brute force attack causes a reactor to try to increase in power suddenly, for example, will the physics be able to protect it? And what if it was more calculated and is introduced in a more stealth way? Can the physics still save you, or you have to do something? And question, there's also another related, can this happen on a systematic basis and until it gets you outside the boundary of safe operation? Okay, so the ultimate goal of this research is mainly thinking about how to design a methodology that can detect if the control system is being compromised. So when I started this work, I got a chance to meet with Elisa Bertino. She's the one that really got me inspired to work on this. And she introduced me to this interesting article, which really combines a lot of different methods that are currently being used for industrial control systems. The idea is, if we have a model for how the system behaves, then we have an idea about how it should perform under normal operations. If it deviates from these normal operations, then something goes wrong. That's the rationale in general for model-based defenses. So we're asking for funding, right? So we have to show that we're doing something different. So the approach that we're taking is that for the class of industrial control systems that are very well understood, and there's so much knowledge in the open domain, it's possible to learn the reactor state from the public domain or even online in using machine learning type approach. And after that, you can try to develop an attack. Okay, and I'll give you an example at the end if we have a few minutes. So if that's the case, we have to think of a different way or different philosophy to protect these systems. And again, I stress that this is to the class of systems that are very well understood and very common to usually part of the critical infrastructure for many countries. So the main message, obviously, we're safe. There's nothing going on. Everything is great. So as I said, since we're already being filmed here, so this is second line of defense. Okay, if something goes wrong, then what would you do? So obviously, there's a lot of things in place already, and there's not imminent danger to these facilities, especially in the nuclear field. I can't speak about other fields. So I'll give you a few seconds to read this quickly. So extremely robust cybersecurity program that's been installed over the past 10 years. All right, so the official facts, systems are safe. Industry cybersecurity programs have been implemented since 2008, and there's a lot of coordination between the government and industry. So there's no reason to jump off your seat and worry about this. Okay, so the goal of this definitely is not to give you some ideas on how the reactors can be attacked or give you detailed recipes of how to do it, because in either way it's a lose-lose situation any way you look at it. So really think about this as a way to serve as to provoke your thought and think about how that applies to your own system. Okay? So as part of the research, we'll have to come up with some recipes of how an attacker would try to, let's say, just cause a meltdown, for example, or cause what's called a LOCA accident, loss of coolant accident. But the goal is not really to share that with you, but just say, if this happens, is there a mathematical approach that can be used to detect it? And you can apply this to your own fields. Okay, so the way we're using the word cyber attack, we're using it very loosely, because obviously in critical infrastructures like nuclear reactors, we want to air gap everything. So we're not really assuming that the attack is coming from the internet or from the cyberspace, but it's mostly probably going to be something like Stuxnet from an insider. So again, this is not something that we are touching on how to do. We're relying on computer experts to help with that line of defense. Okay, so in our context, cyber attack is still employed to denote any type of intrusion, either direct, virus via USB, hacking on site, or some of these crazy techniques that I've just heard about, like data exfiltration, or maybe social engineering, etc. So all those could be ways to initiate the attack, and you guys know that very, very well. So this is obviously the motivation, how this topic became very public news. the one started with the Stuxnet attack, so there's no reason to go over that. So the idea is that we're looking at SCADA system, anything supervisory control of data acquisition. It's something that collects a lot of data from sensors and then sends some commands. Okay, open a valve, close a valve, turn a pump on, off, etc. Okay, so this is an example for SCADA system for a nuclear power plant. So this is something where the energy is being produced. This is something where the energy is being exchanged to generate some steam, and then eventually you turn it into a turbine. So as you can see, there are a lot of sensors throughout the entire system, okay? And because the system is very complex, when you change something somewhere, it will have an impact or a footprint somewhere else, okay? And the idea of model-based defenses is if you can model that, then you can see how things are correlated. So if the attacker just is brute force, introducing a brute force attack, you can easily detect that something is not working correctly. But the premise of our research here is that the attacker has the same schematic as this, because this is something in the open literature. And you'll be amazed by how many PhD theses that were able to produce the operation of reactor very, very accurately. We're usually within 1%, you know, for power distribution, et cetera. So it's amazing how these models have evolved over the years. All right, so the link to the computer science of things is the PLCs, and those are used to send the commands. So the ultimate goal of this research is to take these data analytics techniques that we'll develop and put them as a chip on the PLC, so it can detect whether the traffic is being compromised or not and issue some corrective actions. And that's the link to working with the computer science experts. Okay, so just if I want to outline everything I said so far, with enough resources persistent, we're assuming that the data can be hijacked. And by data here, I mean the data that are being collected routinely during operation. Okay, so flow rate measurements, temperature measurements, flux measurements, et cetera. A lot of levels, like in any type of chemical plants, there are usually a lot of levels, like different species that you have to monitor. If those levels deviate from a certain range, then you know something is wrong. So those are the data we're assuming that the operator will be falsified and the operator won't be able to see them. With these data hijacked, the adversary domain scientist equipped with technical know-how on the safety systems can potentially inflict some damage. So this is, again, the very key point here, key assumption that we're assuming there is a lot of technical know-how on the subject elsewhere. And we're looking for smart ways to see if the system is being manipulated. Okay, the assumptions we're making, the information protection measures have already been bypassed, which is a big assumption, obviously. There's a lot of research on that. But as I said, you can think of this as another line of defense. And the raw data used to control the system that are displayed to the operator can be falsified. That's also another hurdle. And as an example for a nuclear reactor, some examples like in-core instrumentations, flow rate measurements, levels, water levels, et cetera. And then finally, the control system will take some commands, so it has to send commands to the different units to take an action. So I'm assuming that this also can be done or manipulated by your system. So in a reactor, for example, we have something called control rods that go inserted in the core to slow down the chain reaction. So we're assuming that those also can be manipulated. And in current designs, most of these decisions are now being digitized. Okay? We're trying to stay away from analog because they're becoming more obsolete. So there's some voices now that are saying maybe we should stay analog to get away from this problem. You know, so all right. So what is not available in the public domain? Sufficiently accurate models for commercial U.S. reactors do exist in the public domain. And more importantly, the accidents that happen in any type of reactor have to be reported. Okay, all incidents that happen have to be reported, even if minor incidents. So there's a daily report, and that the engineers on site have to file with the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that comes online. So you can access it. And as I said, there are a lot of PhD students that have modeled the systems over the years, and the information is available. You can always get it. And extensive literature exists on the types of accidents that are there. There are still some proprietary details. There's a lot of correlations that, empirical usually correlations that appear, but they're usually, if an expert knows the system, they may not know the values of the parameters, but they know the general dependence of the model. So the premise here is that those unknown parameters can be determined from online monitoring. And what's available to the attacker? As I said, the proprietary details can be acquired. Either somebody steals the data, works in a company or so, meets people, conferences. Usually, you have a pretty good idea about the ranges for this data. So most machine learning techniques work very well if you have an initial good guess of what the data are. So in principle, those can be learned. And then the machine learning techniques that the defender will use to find patterns, correlations, et cetera, those are all public domain also, and the attacker have access to most of these technology as well. Okay, so I think I probably need to keep the time. Check. Okay. Okay, so the basic idea right now, according to my understanding, when you try to detect that there's an attack, is the concept of templates, or templates matching for viruses. So you have some signatures for the incoming attack, and you always match against that. So we actually do something similar. From a very high level, I could see that it's very similar in nuclear industry. Because what we do is we have a list of accidents, possible accidents that could happen. Some smart people sat down and thought of how things can go wrong. And then the vendor for this type of reactor has to show how the reactor will respond to these types of accidents. And if you can convince the regulatory body, then that's a check, you're good. But there's always a lot of in-between cases that could happen. And an example for an accident of this in-between conditions is the 3 Mile Island that happened in the late 70s. So the idea is if you have access to all these records, it's possible to come up with a scenario that will not appear as a design, what's called the design basis accidents. Okay? So we definitely don't want to do this template-based approach. So the idea is instead of creating signatures for the incoming traffics, we're thinking about creating signatures for the entity that we're trying to protect. Okay? So you put the burden basically on the attacker. Every reactor has been operating differently. If you just think about the load follow of any typical plant, that's going to vary from one plant to the other. So the way the composition of the fuel in the system will change, the history of the flow rates, the steam and water levels and different components of the system, that all will be different, especially if you record it over time. So the idea is it possible to generate signatures for the system itself rather than for the incoming traffic? So this way you're putting the burden on the attacker. Okay, so I stressed that the attacker have access to all the machine learning technology that's out there. So some of the initial ideas that came about in this field is, you use outlier anomaly detection techniques, but people quickly showed that you can always falsify your data to be within the range that doesn't trigger these techniques. Then there's a lot of also other work that looks at correlation type signatures. As I said, I showed you the SCADA system for all the measurements, and they're all correlated. So you can use very rigorous correlation techniques to look at how, if this guy goes up, this has to go down in some relative weights and proportions. You can detect that with simulation. So the attacker can also do that. A lot of dimensionality type reduction techniques like principal component analysis, SVD, et cetera, that instead of looking at the entire domain, you can look at some first order type behavior. But I argue that, again, the attacker can do this on the cloud. So the threat scenarios that we are thinking of, I'll give it to you from a very high level. Again, no details here. If this is, for example, some time dependence, and this is some response we're looking at, let's say we're looking at the water level in the steam generator, for example. That takes the water, the heated water from the core and produces steam. So this is what it should be looking like, let's say, in response to some event. So we're looking at two types of accidents here. You could have some initiating event. Like, as I said, there are some design basis accidents that we look for, like if a pipe breaks, for example, what happens? So that's an initiating event. Then maybe we should expect the temperature to rise according to that shape, okay? So if something happens like that, that's maybe when the attacker will start putting his signal, after the accident has initiated. Or they can initiate the accident themselves by turning down a valve partially or closing it completely, and let the system respond on its own. So I look at the types of accidents that can be initiated as these two different ways. Either you initiate something, you wait for something normal to initiate, and then you change the reactor behavior after that, or you are the one who initiates the incident. So I think I can skip those two. Okay. So I want to give you an example here. This is an example for the time dependence of the system, okay? So what we typically do is we have a lot of measurements inside the core that give us an idea about the power. If the power is going up and we want to keep it constant, then we have to insert some control rods to keep the power down. And this is described by this set of differential equations. Those differential equations are well known, okay? But the parameters that appear in these equations are not. They are going to be specific to the system that you are working with, okay? So the idea is if they have measurements for the P, for example. P here is the power level or the flux level. If you can line wait for a long period of time, like let's say several months, and just take note of all these data, then you can learn all the parameters that are in this system via machine learning, okay? So the basic algorithm in this case is that you have, if n is the current time step, and you want to estimate the power for the next time step, you collect the flux monitors at both n and n plus 1. You estimate the reactivity. Reactivity tells you if the reactor wants to increase in power or decrease in power naturally by the physics feedback. And then you solve these equations, and there are standard methods for doing that. It's called IPK predictor corrector type methods. And then if the reactivity does not match what comes from the simulation, then you issue a command. Okay? If the simulation tells you the reactor wants to go up, but the measurements is saying it's trying to go down, then you take a command to make them consistent. Okay? So we took an example of just a reactor in the literature, and the equations. This is all the equations that are associated with that model, and we developed some inverse approach to look for these parameters. Okay? Assuming that we can track the reactor behavior for a few weeks. Okay? And this is what we see. This is the flux that the operator will be able to see. Okay? You can keep it within the range of normal behavior. Everything oscillates due to noise in these measurements. And while the real flux could be going up, raising the power by 20%, which is outside the normal range that's allowed for these systems. So this could be happening just during normal operation. And if you can just increase the reactor power 10% more than what's normally doing, it will shut down maybe a few months early. And that will cause a lot of losses, financial losses. Okay, so our current work really is focused in the first year of the current project is on looking at these model-based defenses. If the engineers have access to these models that describe industrial control systems that are very well understood, could just a lie-in-wait period long enough can allow you to learn the system. And if that's the case, then we argue that you should look for another approach to find signatures. Okay, so I think that's everything I have. Motivated, persistent adversaries can always learn the system if it's already in the public domain, and they can change the reactor state to stay outside the envelope of safe operation. So we should be looking for more sophisticated defense techniques. And again, I don't think this is special to nuclear power. I don't know about the physics of other systems, but I can guess. And so I'd like to use this opportunity to connect with people in other engineering fields, especially that work with systems that are in the open wide literature. And very good description of these systems out there in the public domain, and share some ideas of what you would think we should be doing to protect these systems. Thank you.